Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long. I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 13. This chapter will cover the perfect and pluperfect tenses. We'll look at how these tenses are formed and consider their significance. One thing that we'll need to look at is reduplication, which is one indicator of the formation of the perfect and pluperfect tense. So let's continue by looking at the vocabulary, which contains more third declension nouns. E gune, tes gunekos. E elpis, tes elpidos. E mater, tes matros. E nux, tes nuktos. E sarx, tes sarkos. E charis, tes charitos. E kyr, tes kyros. Notice that I included the feminine articles for both the nominative and the genitive form. And this is a little bit tricky because these third declension feminine nouns will look like they're masculine second declension nouns ending in omicron sigma. This form, when it has the article, which will help you parse it, will have tes gunekos. The neuter third declension nouns presented here are sometimes called ma nouns because they end with ma. They're very regular in their formation, but use third declension endings. To emma, to thelema, to onima, to pneuma, to rema, to sperma, to stoma, to soma. So here's the vocabulary for this lesson. The perfect and pluperfect tenses form the fourth and fifth principal parts. Now we've learned that you can indicate tense by a prefix, possibly by a stem change, the tense indicator and coupling vowel, which can form together to form a coupling syllable, and then the endings. Well, the perfect and pluperfect tenses will have a prefix, which is called reduplication, and in a later section, we'll talk about different ways to form reduplication. There may also be a stem change because we're actually in a different principal part, the fourth and fifth. And then the tense indicator for the perfect is kappa. So we're going to see a kappa with alpha, epsilon endings. And then we'll see the secondary endings. So the perfect active uses the secondary active endings. The perfect middle passive, which is in the fifth principal part, will use the primary middle passive endings. Now the verbal aspect of the perfect and pluperfect tenses is resultative stative. And what this means is that these tenses describe an often complex state of affairs. Now in the indicative mood, this also will entail that something has happened that has brought this complex state of affairs to be. So the pluperfect tense will take this and put it into an even more remote past time. And the pluperfect tense will often have an augment, an epsilon, in addition to the reduplication to help mark this past time orientation in the indicative mood. So the perfect tense would be translated in such a way, I have written. There the focus would be on the writtenness. That's the complex state of affairs that has arisen. If I were to put that same idea into the pluperfect tense, I would put it back in time. In this case, I would say, I had written. So, I have written would be perfect. The pluperfect would be, I had written. Well, here is more on the formation. You need to add a reduplication, and then you add the endings. The perfect active endings are ka, kas, ken, kamen, kate, kasin. You should recognize these endings. They're the secondary active endings. The pluperfect active endings are kin, kis, ki, kimen, kite, kisin. Notice that the third plural forms are slightly different than what you've seen, but this will help differentiate them from other endings. So you add these kappa endings onto the end of the stem. So you can see the formation here. We'll talk about reduplication a little bit later, but This underlined portion is a reduplication taking place. You may also see a stem change because you've moved from the first principal part, the lexical form principal part, into the fourth or the fifth principal part. Now sometimes the kappa will replace the end of the stem, the consonant at the end of the stem. The zeta, for example, will be removed by the kappa. Kappa in the following verbs is completely rejected. This group of verbs that rejects the kappa is sometimes called the second perfects. Translating the perfect and pluperfect is fairly simple. We use the helping verbs have for the perfect and had for the pluperfect. So, pepevstevka, I have trusted. Epipistevkin, I had trusted. Now the perfect and pluperfect middle passive endings use the primary middle passive for the perfect, and for the pluperfect, the secondary middle passive endings. What you'll notice here is that there's no coupling vowel. This is a sign of the pluperfect middle passive and the perfect middle passive. These forms don't use coupling vowels in their formation. So what happens is that these endings are directly abutted to the end of the verb stem. Now sometimes this will create some problems and changes because the addition of a mu directly to the end of a verb ending in a zeta will change that zeta to a sigma. So there'll be some slight adjustments to the end of the verb stem when adding some of these endings. Sometimes the ending will change the stem as well. Grapho will go to gram. And these changes are for the purpose of euphony, that is, sounding better for the sake of good sounds. Translating the perfect middle passive and pluperfect middle passive also uses the helping verbs have and had, but adds also the helping verb been. So, pepistevme is I have been trusted. Epipistevmein is I had been trusted. Here's a list of some of the main uses of these two tenses. These tenses are significant when they are used because they are rather rare. So when an author has chosen to use the perfect tense and or the pluperfect tense, there is special attention being given to the verbal aspect, the resultant state of affairs that these verbs point to. For example, Romans 3:21, but now apart from the law, righteousness from God has been revealed. This is a perfect tense verb form. Notice that it's dependent on a previous action, but the focus is not on the past, it's on the resultant effect that this righteousness has been revealed and is currently operative in the world. Let's look at some rules of reduplication. Reduplication is essentially the doubling of the first consonant on the verb stem and then the addition of an epsilon. This epsilon is not an augment, it's reduplication, and that's really important. For pistevo, the reduplication is the p with an epsilon to form pe pistev. So with these other verbs, like baptizo, grapho, doxazo, sozo, katizo, the reduplication is simply as follows. You double the first consonant, you add an epsilon, and you have the reduplication. These verb forms are rather nice to parse because you'll see that real obvious reduplication on the front. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple because verb stems don't always begin with consonants. If the verb stem begins with a vowel or diphthong or monophthong, there's no consonant to double. So what happens is that a simple epsilon is added to the front. Now this epsilon will then look like an augment, but it is not an augment. And so this is a confusing thing for beginning students when they're parsing verbs. Fortunately, you don't have to rely simply on the reduplication to parse the verb because you will have the perfect and pluperfect endings, which are distinctive. Remember that they'll have the tense indicator of a kappa, and that kappa will also help you parse the verb. Here is what results when you have diphthongs or monophthongs and you have a reduplication added to the front. Compound verbs are reduplicated at the front of their stem. So the reduplication occurs inside of the word after the prepositional prefix. To reduplicate sigma at the beginning of a word that is a part of a consonant cluster, you simply add an epsilon. So for stavrao, the reduplication is e stav at the front. Another special rule occurs with reduplicating aspirated mutes. That is, mutes that are aspirates. Aspirates are mutes that have breathing going through them. Phi, theta, and chi. These are aspirates. Now, to reduplicate these, the reduplication will take off that breathing that's formed the consonant, and you'll be left with a hardened sound that corresponds with the aspirate. So phi will go back to p, and theta will go back to tav, and chi will become a kappa. So you can see how these forms are reduplicated. The pluperfect form of ida is aidin. Aidin is actually a pluperfect in form, but it's translated as a simple past, like an aorist in the indicative mood. So you can see the forms there and their relative frequencies. They're not that common in the New Testament, but for thoroughness, I thought I would include these forms here. Well, that just about wraps it up for this chapter. If you want to read more about the options that an author has to represent past time in the indicative mood, you can read 13.5. I think it's a very interesting study, but you may not be up for it. I also have just a brief discussion here of third declension nouns that are presented in this chapter. Be sure to do the checkpoint, the practice, and before you leave the chapter, read the case in point, which looks at perfected love in 1 John.